Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to The Well-Told Tale. Every week we bring you the finest science fiction and fantasy stories ever written. Today we return to Alice Through the Looking Glass. Everything here is backwards or wrong or nonsense. Having navigated Tweedledum and Tweedledee, Alice is working her way across the chessboard of this land, and now, as we pick up the story, she finds herself reaching for an egg that is getting further and further away. Who will she meet next? It's time to pull up a chair, relax and enjoy part 3 of Alice Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. Chapter 6. Humpty Dumpty. However, the egg only got larger and more human, and when she had come within a few yards of it, she saw that it had eyes and a nose and mouth, and when she had come close to it, she saw clearly that it was Humpty Dumpty himself. "It can't be anyone else," she said to herself. "I'm as certain of it as if his name were written all over his face." It might have been written 100 times easily on that enormous face. Humpty Dumpty was sitting with his legs crossed, like a Turk on the top of a high wall, such a narrow one that Alice quite wondered how he could keep his balance, and as his eyes were steadily fixed in the opposite direction, and he didn't take the least notice of her, she thought he must be a stuffed figure after all. "And how exactly like an egg he is," she said aloud, standing with her hands ready to catch him, for she was every moment expecting him to fall. "It's very provoking," Humpty Dumpty said, after a long silence, looking away from Alice as he spoke, "to be called an egg. Very." "I said you looked like an egg, sir," Alice gently explained, "and some eggs are very pretty, you know," she added, hoping to turn her remark into some sort of compliment. "Some people," said Humpty Dumpty, looking away from her as usual, "have no more sense than a baby." Alice didn't know what to say to this. It wasn't at all like conversation, she thought, as he never said anything to her. In fact, his last remark was evidently addressed to a tree, so she stood and softly repeated to herself, "Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty in his place again." "That last line is much too long for the poetry," she added, almost out loud, forgetting that Humpty Dumpty would hear her. "Don't stand there chattering to yourself like that," Humpty Dumpty said, looking at her for the first time, "but tell me your name and your business." "My name is Alice, but—" "It's a stupid enough name," Humpty Dumpty interrupted impatiently. "What does it mean?" "Must a name mean something?" Alice asked doubtfully. "Of course it must," Humpty Dumpty said with a short laugh. "My name means the shape I am. And a good, handsome shape it is, too. With a name like yours, you might be any shape, almost." "Why do you sit out here all alone?" said Alice, not wishing to begin an argument. "Why? Because there's nobody with me," cried Humpty Dumpty. "Did you think I didn't know the answer to that? Ask another." "Don't you think you'd be safer down on the ground?" Alice went on, not with any idea of making another riddle, but simply in her good-natured anxiety for the queer creature. "That wall is so very narrow." "What tremendously easy riddles you ask," Humpty Dumpty growled out. "Of course I don't think so. Why, if I ever did fall off, which there's no chance of, but if I did—" Here he pursed his lips and looked so solemn and grand that Alice could hardly help laughing. "If I did fall," he went on, "the king has promised me, with his very own mouth, to send all his horses and all his men," Alice interrupted, rather unwisely. "Now, I declare that's too bad," Humpty Dumpty cried, breaking into sudden passion. "You've been listening at doors and behind trees and down chimneys, or you couldn't have known it." "I haven't, indeed," Alice said very quietly. "It's in a book." "Ah, well, they may write such things in a book," Humpty Dumpty said in a calmer tone. "That's what you call a history of England, that is. Now, take a good look at me. I'm one that has spoken to a king, I am. Mayhap you'll never see such another. And to show you I'm not proud, you may shake hands with me." And he grinned almost from ear to ear as he leaned forward, and as nearly as possible fell off the wall in doing so, and offered Alice his hand. She watched him a little anxiously as she took it. If he smiled much more, the ends of his mouth might meet behind, she thought, and then I don't know what would happen to his head. I'm afraid it would come off. "Yes, all his horses and all his men," Humpty Dumpty went on. "They'd pick me up again in a minute. They would. However, this conversation is going a little too fast. Let's go back to the last remark but one." "I'm afraid I can't quite remember it," Alice said very politely. "In that case, we start fresh," said Humpty Dumpty, "and it's my turn to choose a subject." "He talks about it just as if it was a game," thought Alice. "So, here's a question for you. How old did you say you were?" Alice made a short calculation and said, 7 years and 6 months. "Wrong," Humpty Dumpty exclaimed triumphantly. "You never said a word like it." "I thought you meant, how old are you?" Alice explained. "If I'd meant that, I'd have said it," said Humpty Dumpty. Alice didn't want to begin another argument, so she said nothing. 7 years and 6 months, Humpty Dumpty repeated thoughtfully. "An uncomfortable sort of age. Now, if you'd asked my advice, I'd have said, leave off at 7, but it's too late now." "I never ask advice about growing," Alice said indignantly. "Too proud?" the other inquired. Alice felt even more indignant at this suggestion. "I mean," she said, "that one can't help growing older." "One can't, perhaps," said Humpty Dumpty, "but 2 can. With proper assistance, you might have left off at 7. "What a beautiful belt you've got on," Alice suddenly remarked. They had had quite enough of the subject of age, she thought, and if they really were to take turns in choosing subjects, it was her turn now. At least, she corrected herself on second thoughts, a beautiful cravat. I should have said... no, a belt, I mean. I beg your pardon, she added in dismay, for Humpty Dumpty looked thoroughly offended, and she began to wish she hadn't chosen that subject. If I only knew, she thought to herself, which was neck and which was waist. Evidently Humpty Dumpty was very angry, though he said nothing for a minute or two. When he did speak again, it was in a deep growl. "It is a most provoking thing," he said at last, "when a person doesn't know a cravat from a belt." "I know it's very ignorant of me," Alice said, in so humble a tone that Humpty Dumpty relented. "It's a cravat, child, and a beautiful one, as you say. It's a present from the White King and Queen. There now." "Is it really?" said Alice, quite pleased to find that she had chosen a good subject after all. "They gave it to me," Humpty Dumpty continued thoughtfully, as he crossed one knee over the other and clasped his hands round it. "They gave it to me for an unbirthday present." "I beg your pardon?" Alice said, with a puzzled air. "I'm not offended," said Humpty Dumpty. "I mean, what is an unbirthday present?" "A present given when it isn't your birthday, of course." Alice considered a little. "I like birthday presents best," she said at last. "You don't know what you're talking about," cried Humpty Dumpty. "How many days are there in a year?" 365, said Alice. "And how many birthdays have you?" 1. "And if you take 1 from 365, what remains?" 364, of course. Humpty Dumpty looked doubtful. "I'd rather see that one done on paper," he said. Alice couldn't help smiling as she took out her memorandum book and worked the sum for him. 365 minus 1 equals 364. Humpty Dumpty took the book and looked at it carefully. "That seems to be done right," he began. "You're holding it upside down," Alice interrupted. "To be sure I was," Humpty Dumpty said gaily as she turned it round for him. "I thought it looked a little queer. As I was saying, That seems to be done right, though I haven't time to look it over thoroughly just now, and that shows that there are 364 days when you might get an unbirthday present. Certainly, said Alice, and only one day for birthday presents, you know. There's glory for you. I don't know what you mean by glory, Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant there's a nice knock-down argument for you. But glory doesn't mean a nice knock-down argument, Alice objected. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master, that's all. Alice was too puzzled to say anything, so after a minute Humpty Dumpty began again. They've a temper, some of them, particularly verbs, they're the proudest. Adjectives you can do anything with, but not verbs. However, I can manage the whole lot of them. Impenetrability, that's what I say. Would you tell me, please, what that means? Now you talk like a reasonable child, said Humpty Dumpty, looking very much pleased. I meant by impenetrability that we've had enough of that subject, and it would be just as well if you'd mention what you mean to do next, as I suppose you don't mean to stop here all the rest of your life. That's a great deal to make one word mean, said Alice in a thoughtful tone. When I make a word do a lot of work like that, said Humpty Dumpty, I always pay it extra. Oh, said Alice. She was too much puzzled to make another remark. Ah, you should see 'em come round me on a Saturday night, said Humpty Dumpty, wagging his head gravely from side to side, for to get their wages, you know. Alice didn't venture to ask what he paid them with, and so you see, I can't tell you. You seem very clever at explaining words, sir, said Alice. Would you kindly tell me the meaning of the poem called Jabberwocky? Let's hear it, said Humpty Dumpty. I can explain all the poems that were ever invented, and a good many that haven't been invented just yet. This sounded very hopeful, so Alice repeated the first verse. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome wroths outgrabe. That's enough to begin with, Humpty Dumpty interrupted. There are plenty of hard words there. Brillig means 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the time when you begin broiling things for dinner. That'll do very well, said Alice. And slithy? Well, slithy means lithe and slimy. Lithe is the same as active. You see, it's like a portmanteau. There are two meanings packed up into one word. I see it now, Alice remarked thoughtfully. And what are toves? Well, toves are something like badgers. They're something like lizards, and they're something like corkscrews. They must be very curious-looking creatures. They are that, said Humpty Dumpty. Also, they make their nests under sundials. Also, they live on cheese. And what's the gyre and to gimble? To gyre is to go round and round like a gyroscope. To gimble is to make holes like a gimlet. And the wabe is the grass plot around a sundial, I suppose, said Alice, surprised at her own ingenuity. Of course it is. It's called wabe, you know, because it goes a long way before it and a long way behind it. And a long way beyond it on each side, Alice added. Exactly so. Well then, mimsy is flimsy and miserable. There's another portmanteau for you. And borogove is a thin, shabby-looking bird with its feathers sticking out all around, something like a live mop. And then mome raths, said Alice. I'm afraid I'm giving you a great deal of trouble. Well, a rath is a sort of green pig, but mome, I'm not certain about. I think it's short for from home, meaning that they'd lost their way, you know. And what does outgrabe mean? Well, outgrabbing is something between bellowing and whistling, with a kind of sneeze in the middle. However, you'll hear it done, maybe, down in the wood yonder, and when you've heard it, you'll be quite content. Who's been repeating all that hard stuff to you?" "I read it in a book," said Alice, "but I had some poetry repeated to me, much easier than that. By Tweedle, I think it was." "As to poetry, you know," said Humpty Dumpty, stretching out one of his great hands, "I can repeat poetry as well as other folk, if it comes to that." "Oh, it needn't come to that," Alice hastily said, hoping to keep him from beginning. "The piece I'm going to repeat," he went on, without noticing her remark, "was written entirely for your amusement." Alice felt that in that case she really ought to listen to it, so she sat down and said, "Thank you," rather sadly. "In winter, when the fields are white, I sing this song for your delight. Only I don't sing it," he added, as an explanation. "I see you don't," said Alice. "If you can see whether I'm singing or not, you've got sharper eyes than most," Humpty Dumpty remarked severely. Alice was silent. "In spring, when woods are getting green, I'll try and tell you what I mean." "Thank you very much," said Alice. "In summer, when the days are long, perhaps you'll understand the song. In autumn, when the leaves are brown, take pen and ink and write it down." "I will, if I remember it so long," said Alice. "You needn't go on making remarks like that," Humpty Dumpty said. "They're not sensible, and they put me out." "I sent a message to the fish. I told them, 'This is what I wish.' The little fishes of the sea, they sent an answer back to me. The little fish's answer was, 'We cannot do it, sir, because—'" "I'm afraid I don't quite understand," said Alice. "It gets easier further on," Humpty Dumpty replied. "I sent to them again to say, 'It will be better to obey.' The fishes answered with a grin, 'Why, what a temper you are in!' I told them once, I told them twice, they would not listen to advice. I took a kettle large and new, fit for the deed I had to do. My heart went hop, my heart went thump, I filled the kettle at the pump. Then someone came to me and said, 'The little fishes are in bed.' I said to him, I said it plain, 'Then you must wake them up again.' I said it very loud and clear, I went and shouted in his ear." Humpty Dumpty raised his voice almost to a scream as he repeated this verse, and Alice thought with a shudder, "I wouldn't have been the messenger for anything." "But he was very stiff and proud. He said, 'You needn't shout so loud.' And he was very proud and stiff. He said, 'I'd go and wake them if—' I took a corkscrew from the shelf. I went to wake them up myself. And when I found the door was locked, I pulled and pushed and kicked and knocked. And when I found the door was shut, I tried to turn the handle, but—" There was a long pause. "Is that all?" Alice asked timidly. "That's all," said Humpty Dumpty. "Goodbye." This was rather sudden, Alice thought, but after such a very strong hint that she ought to be going, she felt that it would hardly be civil to stay, so she got up and held out her hand. "Goodbye, till we meet again," she said as cheerfully as she could. "I shouldn't know you again if we did meet," Humpty Dumpty replied in a discontented tone, giving her one of his fingers to shake. "You're so exactly like other people." "The face is what one goes by, generally," Alice remarked in a thoughtful tone. "That's just what I complain of," said Humpty Dumpty. "Your face is the same as everyone has. The 2 eyes, so," marking their places in the air with his thumb, "nose in the middle, mouth under, it's always the same. Now, if you had the 2 eyes on the same side of the nose, for instance, or the mouth at the top, that would be some help." "It wouldn't look nice," Alice objected, but Humpty Dumpty only shut his eyes and said, "Wait till you've tried." Alice waited a minute to see if he would speak again, but as he never opened his eyes or took any further notice of her, she said, "Goodbye," once more, and getting no answer to this, she quietly walked away, but she couldn't help saying to herself as she went, "Of all the unsatisfactory—" She repeated this aloud, as it was a great comfort to have such a long word to say, "Of all the unsatisfactory people I ever met." She never finished the sentence, for at this moment a heavy crash shook the forest from end to end. Chapter 7. The Lion and the Unicorn. The next moment, soldiers came running through the wood, at first in 2s and 3s, then 10 or 20 together, and at last in such crowds that they seemed to fill the whole forest. Alice got behind a tree for fear of being run over and watched them go. She thought that in all her life she had never seen soldiers so uncertain on their feet. They were always tripping over something or other, and whenever one went down, several more always fell over him, so that the ground was soon covered with little heaps of men. Then came the horses. Having 4 feet, these managed rather better than the foot soldiers, but even they stumbled now and then, and it seemed to be a regular rule that whenever a horse stumbled, the rider fell off instantly. The confusion got worse every moment, and Alice was very glad to get out of the wood into an open place, where she found the White King seated on the ground, busily writing in his memorandum book. "I've sent them all," the king cried in a tone of delight on seeing Alice. "Did you happen to meet any soldiers, my dear, as you came through the wood?" "Yes, I did," said Alice. "Several thousand, I should think." 4,207. "That's the exact number," the king said, referring to his book. "I couldn't send all the horses, you know, because 2 of them are wanted in the game, and I haven't sent the 2 messengers either. They're both gone to the town. Just look along the road and tell me if you can see either of them." "I see nobody on the road," said Alice. "I only wish I had such eyes," the king remarked in a fretful tone, "to be able to see nobody, and at that distance too. Why, it's as much as I can do to see real people by this light." All this was lost on Alice, who was still looking intently along the road, shading her eyes with one hand. "I see somebody now," she exclaimed at last, "but he's coming very slowly. And what curious attitudes he goes into!" For the messenger kept skipping up and down and wriggling like an eel as he came along, with his great hands spread out like fans on each side. "Not at all," said the king. "He's an Anglo-Saxon messenger, and those are Anglo-Saxon attitudes. He only does them when he's happy. His name is Higher." He pronounced it so as to rhyme with mayor. "I love my love with an H," Alice couldn't help beginning, "because he is happy. I hate him with an H, because he is hideous. I fed him with ham sandwiches and hay. His name is Higher, and he lives on the hill," the king remarked simply, without the least idea that he was joining in the game, while Alice was hesitating for the name of a town beginning with H. "The other messenger's called Hatter. I must have 2, you know, to come and go. 1 to come, 1 to go." "I beg your pardon?" said Alice. "It isn't respectable to beg," said the king. "I only meant that I didn't understand," said Alice. "Why 1 to come and 1 to go?" "Didn't I tell you?" the king replied impatiently. "I must have 2 to fetch and carry, 1 to fetch and 1 to carry." At this moment the messenger arrived. He was far too much out of breath to say a word, and could only wave his hands about and make the most fearful faces at the poor king. "This young lady loves you with an H," the king said, introducing Alice in the hope of turning off the messenger's attention from himself, but it was no use. The Anglo-Saxon attitudes only got more extraordinary every moment, while the great eyes rolled wildly from side to side. "You alarm me," said the king. "I feel faint. Give me a ham sandwich." On which the messenger, to Alice's great amusement, opened a bag that hung around his neck and handed a sandwich to the king, who devoured it greedily. "Another sandwich," said the king. "There's nothing but hay left now," the messenger said, peeping into the bag. "Hay, then," the king murmured in a faint whisper. Alice was glad to see that it revived him a good deal. "There's nothing like eating hay when you're faint," he remarked to her as he munched away. "I should think throwing cold water over you would be better," Alice suggested, "or some sal volatile." "I didn't say there was nothing better," the king replied. "I said there was nothing like it," which Alice did not venture to deny. "Who did you pass on the road?" the king went on, holding out his hand to the messenger for some more hay. "Nobody," said the messenger. "Quite right," said the king. "This young lady saw him too, so of course nobody walks slower than you." "I do my best," the messenger said in a sulky tone. "I'm sure nobody walks much faster than I do." "He can't do that," said the king, "or else he'll have been here first. However, now you've got your breath, you may tell me what's happened in the town." "I'll whisper it," said the messenger, putting his hands to his mouth in the shape of a trumpet and stooping so as to get close to the king's ear. Alice was very sorry for this, as she wanted to hear the news too. However, instead of whispering, he simply shouted at the top of his voice, "They're at it again!" "You call that a whisper?" cried the poor king, jumping up and shaking himself. "If you do such a thing again, I'll have you buttered. It went through and through my head like an earthquake." It would have to be a very tiny earthquake, thought Alice. "Who are at it again?" she ventured to ask. "Why, the lion and the unicorn, of course," said the king. "Fighting for the crown?" "Yes, to be sure," said the king, "and the best of the joke is that it's my crown all the while. Let's run and see them." And they trotted off. Alice repeated to herself as she ran the words of the old song. The lion and the unicorn were fighting for the crown. The lion beat the unicorn all round the town. Some gave them white bread, some gave them brown, some gave them plum cake and drummed them out of town. "Does the one that wins get the crown?" she asked, as well as she could, for the run was putting her quite out of breath. "Dear me, no," said the king. "What an idea!" "Would you be good enough," Alice panted out after running a little further, "to stop a minute, just to get one's breath?" "I'm good enough," the king said, "only I'm not strong enough. You see, a minute goes by so fearfully quickly. You might as well try and stop a bandersnatch." Alice had no more breath for talking, so they trotted on in silence, till they came in sight of a great crowd, in the middle of which the lion and the unicorn were fighting. They were in such a cloud of dust that at first Alice could not make out which was which, but she soon managed to distinguish the unicorn by his horn. They placed themselves close to where Hatter, the other messenger, was standing, watching the fight, with a cup of tea in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. "He's only just got out of prison, and he hasn't finished his tea when he was sent in," Haya whispered to Alice, "and they only give them oyster shells in there, so you see he's very hungry and thirsty. How are you, dear child?" he went on, putting his arm affectionately around Hatter's neck. Hatter looked round and nodded and went on with his bread and butter. "Were you happy in prison, dear child?" said Haya. Hatter looked round once more, and this time a tear or two trickled down his cheek, but not a word would he say. "Speak, can't you?" Haya cried impatiently, but Hatter only munched away and drank some more tea. "Speak, won't you?" cried the king. "How are they getting on with the fight?" Hatter made a desperate effort and swallowed a large piece of bread and butter. "They're getting on very well," he said in a choking voice. "Each of them has been down about 87 times. "Then I suppose they'll soon bring the white bread and the brown," Alice ventured to remark. "It's waiting for 'em now," said Hatter. "This is a bit of it as I'm eating." There was a pause in the fight just then, and the lion and the unicorn sat down, panting, while the king called out, 10 minutes allowed for refreshments." Haya and Hatter set to work at once, carrying rough trays of white and brown bread. Alice took a piece to taste, but it was very dry. "I don't think they'll fight any more today," the king said to Hatter. "Go and order the drums to begin." And Hatter went bounding away like a grasshopper. For a minute or two, Alice stood silent, watching him. Suddenly she brightened up. "Look, look," she cried, pointing eagerly. "There's the White Queen running across the country." She came flying out of the wood over yonder. "How fast those queens can run!" "There's some enemy after her, no doubt," the king said, without even looking round. "That wood's full of them." "But aren't you going to run and help her?" Alice asked, very much surprised at his taking it so quietly. No use," said the king. "She runs so fearfully quick. You might as well try and catch a bandersnatch. But I'll make a memorandum about her if you like. She's a dear good creature," he repeated softly to himself as he opened his memorandum book. "Do you spell creature with a double E?" At this moment the unicorn sauntered by them with his hands in his pockets. "I had the best time of it this time," he said to the king, just glancing at him as he passed. A little," the king replied rather nervously. "You should have run him through with your horn, you know." "It didn't hurt him," the unicorn said carelessly as he was going on, when his eye happened to fall upon Alice. He turned round rather instantly and stood for some time looking at her with an air of the deepest disgust. "What is this?" he said at last. "This is a child," Haya replied eagerly, coming in front of Alice to introduce her and spreading out both his hands towards her in an Anglo-Saxon attitude. "We only found it today. It's as large as life and twice as natural." "I always thought they were fabulous monsters," said the unicorn. "Is it alive?" "It can talk," said Haya solemnly. The unicorn looked dreamily at Alice and said, "Talk, child?" Alice could not help her lips curling up into a smile as she began, "Do you know, I always thought unicorns were fabulous monsters too. I never saw one alive before." "Well, now that we have seen each other," said the unicorn, "if you'll believe in me, I'll believe in you. Is that a bargain?" "Yes, if you like," said Alice. "Come, fetch out the plum cake, old man," the unicorn went on, turning from her to the king. "None of your brown bread for me." "Certainly, certainly," the king muttered and beckoned to Haya. "Open the bag," he whispered. "Quick! Not that one, that's full of hay." Haya took a large cake out of the bag and gave it to Alice to hold while he got out a dish and carving knife. How they all came out of it, Alice couldn't guess. It was just like a conjuring trick, she thought. The lion had joined them while this was going on, and he looked very tired and sleepy, and his eyes were half shut. "What's this?" he said, blinking lazily at Alice and speaking in a deep, hollow tone that sounded like the tolling of a great bell. What is it now?" the unicorn cried eagerly. "You'll never guess. I couldn't." The lion looked at Alice wearily. "Are you animal, vegetable, or mineral?" he said, yawning at every other word. "It's a fabulous monster," the unicorn cried out before Alice could reply. "Then hand around the plum cake, monster," the lion said, lying down and putting his chin on his paws. "And sit down, both of you," said the king and the unicorn. "Fair play with the cake, you know." The king was evidently very uncomfortable at having to sit down between the two great creatures, but there was no other place for him. "What a fight we might have for that crown now," the unicorn said, looking slyly up at the crown, which the poor king was nearly shaking off his head, he trembled so much. "I should win easily," said the lion. "I'm not so sure of that," said the unicorn. "Why, I beat you all around the town, you chicken," the lion replied angrily, half getting up as he spoke. Here the king interrupted to prevent the quarrel going on. He was very nervous and his voice quite quivered. "All around the town," he said. "That's a good long way. Did you go by the old bridge or the marketplace? You get the best view by the old bridge." "I'm sure I don't know," the lion growled as he lay down again. "There was too much dust to see anything. What a time the monster is cutting up that cake." Alice had seated herself on the bank of a little brook, with the great dish on her knees, and was sawing away diligently with the knife. "It's very provoking," she said, in reply to the lion. She was getting quite used to being called the monster. "I've cut several slices already, but they always join on again." "You don't know how to manage looking-glass cakes," the unicorn remarked. "Hand it round first and cut it afterward." This sounded nonsense, but Alice very obediently got up and carried the dish around, and the cake divided itself into 3 pieces as she did so. "Now, cut it up," said the lion, as she returned to her place with the empty dish. "I say, this isn't fair," cried the unicorn, as Alice sat with the knife in her hand, very much puzzled how to begin. "The monster has given the lion twice as much as me." "She's kept none for herself, anyhow," said the lion. "Do you like plum cake, monster?" But before Alice could answer him, the drums began. Where the noise came from she couldn't make out. The air seemed full of it, and it rang through and through her head till she felt quite deafened. She started to her feet and sprang across the little brook in her terror, and had just time to see the lion and the unicorn rise to their feet with angry looks at being interrupted in their feast, before she dropped to her knees and put her hands over her ears, vainly trying to shut out the dreadful uproar. "Well, if that doesn't drum them out of town," she thought to herself, "nothing ever will." And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed part 3 of Alice Through the Looking Glass. If you did enjoy it, then please consider supporting The Well Told Tale on Patreon at patreon.com/thewelltoldtale. There's a link in the description. I'll be back next week with the final part of this tale. Will Alice reach the 8th rank and become a queen? Perhaps we'll find out next time. I hope you can join me.